Everyone laughed when Daniel Walker spent his last savings on 30 beehives instead of expensive chemicals. They called him desperate. They said a few insects could never save a dying ranch. But just months later, the same neighbors stood speechless as his orchards bloomed, his fields turned green again, and a shocking act of sabotage exposed the people who wanted him to fail. Stay with us until the end to discover how one man's faith in nature changed an entire community. And don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories like this. A warm June breeze drifted across the rolling farmland of eastern Kansas as golden sunlight settled over fading orchards and dry alfalfa fields beneath a cloudless morning sky. Daniel Walker stood quietly at the edge of his family's 80-acre ranch, watching honeybees struggle to find blossoms among trees that had flowered beautifully only weeks earlier. At 52, he was tall and broad-shouldered, his once powerful frame now carrying the weight of endless seasons filled with disappointment. Thick, dark brown hair had turned silver around his temples, and a neatly trimmed gray beard framed a weathered face marked by years beneath the prairie sun. Calm blue eyes reflected patience more than optimism. Ever since losing his wife, Rebecca, to cancer 6 years earlier, Daniel had become a quieter man, speaking little but noticing everything around him. The ranch had become both his refuge and the promise he refused to break. For 2 straight years, he had poured every dollar he could spare into saving the land. He replaced irrigation lines, experimented with new crop varieties, restored exhausted soil, and even sold nearly half his cattle to cover rising costs. Yet every spring brought the same cruel pattern. Apple trees exploded with blossoms before producing only scattered fruit. Pumpkin vines spread across healthy-looking fields but yielded disappointing harvests. The land appeared alive, yet something essential had quietly disappeared. That answer arrived with Dr. Laura Bennett. At 43, Laura was a practical agricultural ecologist with shoulder-length auburn hair, clear green eyes behind thin glasses, and an easy confidence earned from years studying pollinators instead of office reports. After spending an entire afternoon walking Daniel's fields, kneeling beside wildflowers, and examining the orchards, she finally looked up with a thoughtful smile. "Your soil isn't your biggest problem," she said. "Neither is your water." Daniel frowned. "You've lost your pollinators." She explained how decades of habitat loss and heavy chemical use across neighboring farms had drastically reduced local honeybee populations. Without enough pollinators, healthy plants simply could not produce the harvest they once had. Her solution sounded almost unbelievable. Introduce managed honeybee colonies while restoring strips of native wildflowers throughout the ranch. News traveled fast. By the following afternoon, Daniel's neighbor, Roy Carter, a stocky 60-year-old cattle rancher with a booming laugh and a habit of teasing everyone he liked, leaned against the fence shaking his head as a flatbed truck unloaded dozens of wooden beehives. "You've finally lost it, Danny." Roy chuckled. "Trying to save 80 acres with bugs." The laughter spread through town before sunset. Even Victor Hayes, the polished 50-year-old owner of the county's largest agricultural chemical company, stopped by wearing spotless boots and an expensive smile. He politely offered Daniel a costly package of fertilizers and growth enhancers, insisting that insects could never rescue a dying ranch. Daniel simply looked at the rows of unopened beehives. Every dollar he had left was resting inside those wooden boxes. If Laura was wrong, 3 generations of family history would disappear with them. Still, as the first hive was lowered onto the grass, he made his choice without looking back. 6 weeks passed, and Daniel Walker quickly discovered that buying honeybees had been the easiest part of the journey. Keeping them healthy demanded patience that could not be purchased. Several colonies struggled to adjust after being relocated, and 2 hives became unusually defensive during the first hot spell of July. Daniel spent every sunrise beside the apiary instead of the cattle pasture, learning to read the bees' behavior through quiet observation rather than panic. He carefully replaced damaged frames, added shallow water stations filled with floating pebbles so the bees would not drown, and followed every recommendation Dr. Laura Bennett had written inside a weathered notebook she had left behind. The work reminded him of caring for Rebecca during her long illness, Small acts repeated faithfully every day without knowing when hope might finally appear. The town, however, noticed something very different. Pictures of Daniel wearing his white beekeeper's suit began circulating across local social media. Someone edited wings onto his back and labeled him the Bee Whisperer of Harper County. Another post renamed Walker Ranch the Honey Hotel. Teenagers laughed, older ranchers rolled their eyes at the feed store, and several longtime customers quietly canceled produce orders. Worried that thousands of bees somehow meant unsafe food, Daniel never replied online. Every evening he simply closed the laptop, walked outside, and listened to the steady hum drifting across the fields. The sound irritated everyone else. To him it sounded like determination. Laura continued visiting once every week. Together, they planted long strips of purple coneflowers, black-eyed Susans, balm, goldenrod, and native asters along the edges of orchards and irrigation ditches. She explained that healthy pollinators needed food throughout the growing season rather than only during apple blossom. Daniel realized he had spent decades thinking only about crops while overlooking everything living between them. By mid-July, the ranch began changing in ways too small for careless eyes, but impossible for a patient farmer to ignore. Apple trees that usually dropped tiny fruit suddenly held firm. Pumpkin vines produced fresh blossoms every morning, each surrounded by busy clouds of honeybees moving methodically from flower to flower. Alfalfa fields developed a richer shade of green, while butterflies returned in numbers Daniel had not seen since his children were young. Songbirds appeared before sunrise, feeding on insects that had also returned as chemical spraying declined. For the first time in years, the ranch sounded alive instead of merely occupied. One evening, Daniel propped his old phone against a fence post and recorded a simple video. There were no dramatic speeches or clever editing. He slowly walked from the flowering borders toward the orchard, showing bees disappearing into blossoms, young apples growing where empty stems had hung the previous year, and wildflowers bending beneath countless pollinators. Looking directly into the camera, he admitted, "6 weeks ago, I wasn't sure I'd made the right decision. I'm still learning every day. But the land is answering before the people are." The video attracted only a few hundred views during its first night. Daniel barely thought about it until his phone began ringing the next afternoon. The first caller was Ethan Collins, a 48-year-old hay farmer from the neighboring county. Tall, lean, sunburned, with sandy blonde hair and a soft-spoken manner shaped by years of working alone, Ethan admitted he had laughed when he first heard about the bees. Now he wanted to know whether pollination could explain why his clover fields had steadily declined over the past decade. Later that day, another call came from a retired orchard owner asking where Daniel had purchased his colonies. Before sunset, 3 more farmers left voice messages requesting visits. Even Roy Carter noticed the difference. Standing beside the fence, one evening he watched hundreds of bees moving calmly through blooming wildflowers. "I'll admit one thing," Roy said with a reluctant grin. "Your fields don't look as tired anymore." Daniel smiled, but said nothing. Across town, another pair of eyes had also been watching the growing attention surrounding Walker Ranch. Inside his spotless office, Victor Hayes quietly closed Daniel's video after watching it for the 3rd time. For the first time since Daniel had refused his expensive proposal, Victor's confident smile disappeared. If enough farmers started believing bees could restore production naturally, far fewer would be buying the chemical packages that had built his business. Outside, the evening sun settled across Walker Ranch as thousands of honeybees continued their final flights of the day, unaware that their greatest challenge had not yet begun. The first signs of success spread through Harper County much faster than Daniel Walker expected, but so did the resistance. Every new phone call from a curious farmer seemed to be followed by another rumor questioning everything he had built. Within 2 weeks, local community pages were filled with alarming posts claiming that honeybees from Walker Ranch carried diseases, contaminated fruit, and threatened children playing outdoors. One anonymous account even insisted that Daniel's bees were responsible for livestock illnesses miles away, despite offering no evidence at all. Daniel recognized the pattern immediately. Someone wanted fear to spread faster than facts. The consequences arrived quickly. A family-owned restaurant that had purchased Daniel's apples for nearly 8 years called to postpone its autumn order until the situation became clearer. 2 grocery stores quietly removed his honey from future purchase lists before he had even harvested a single jar. Parents began asking whether school buses should avoid driving near the ranch during field trips. Daniel felt the same knot tightening inside his chest that he had known during Rebecca's final months. The painful feeling of watching something precious slip away while being unable to stop it. Laura Bennett refused to let discouragement take root. Sitting beside Daniel beneath the shade of an old cottonwood tree, she spread several research reports across the picnic table. "Rumors grow in silence," she said calmly. "Science grows where people can see it." Her words stayed with Daniel long after she drove away. That evening he called his oldest friend, Michael Brooks. At 53, Michael was a former volunteer firefighter with a broad chest, square jaw, short black hair touched with gray, and rough hands that never seemed to stop fixing something. 20 years earlier, he had lost his own family orchard to a lightning-sparked wildfire, an experience that made him value preparation over panic. Unlike most people in town, Michael never laughed when Daniel bought the bees. "You don't need another argument," Michael told him. "You need an invitation." Within days they planned what Daniel called Open Ranch Day. Instead of defending himself online, Daniel opened every gate on the property. Invitations were mailed to neighboring ranchers, county agricultural officials, teachers, local reporters, and anyone willing to ask honest questions. Michael organized parking areas and walking paths, while volunteers cleaned the barns and installed simple wooden signs explaining the flowering strips, water stations, and apiary safety rules. On the morning of the event, Daniel barely slept. He worried about everything that could go wrong. What if someone was stung? What if the bees behaved aggressively? What if almost nobody came? By 10 o'clock, more than 70 visitors had arrived. Laura guided the first group through the orchard, explaining how pollination affected fruit production and why native flowers supported healthy bee populations throughout the growing season. She demonstrated the difference between blossoms visited by pollinators and those left untouched, allowing visitors to compare developing fruit with their own eyes instead of trusting charts alone. Daniel spoke only when someone asked a question. He admitted his early mistakes, explained how often he inspected the hives, and described why he had reduced chemical spraying. His honesty impressed people more than polished speeches ever could. Among the visitors was Grace Sullivan, a 35-year-old reporter for the Harper County Gazette. Grace was slender, with shoulder-length dark brown hair, thoughtful hazel eyes, and a quiet habit of listening far longer than she spoke. Years covering natural disasters had taught her to distrust dramatic headlines without evidence. Instead of searching for conflict, she spent nearly 2 hours interviewing farmers, photographing blooming orchards, and watching bees disappear into pumpkin flowers. By late afternoon, even Roy Carter seemed unusually quiet. Finally, he scratched the back of his neck and muttered, "Danny, I guess I owe you one apology." Daniel smiled warmly. "Just wait until harvest." Grace's article appeared online that evening beneath the headline, "Walker Ranch opens its gates and its results speak for themselves." The story included photographs of healthy orchards, blooming flower strips, and local farmers asking genuine questions instead of laughing. The response changed almost overnight. Dozens of supportive comments replaced weeks of ridicule. Several ranchers requested Laura's contact information. The restaurant manager called Daniel personally and restored the canceled apple contract. Even the county agricultural office confirmed that inspectors would visit the ranch with an open mind rather than relying on anonymous complaints. Standing beside the apiary, as the sun disappeared beyond the fields, Daniel finally allowed himself to believe that honesty had defeated fear. He had no idea someone was already planning a far more dangerous way to destroy everything he had rebuilt. Daniel Walker woke before sunrise on the morning scheduled for the county's official inspection. The air was cool, the fields were quiet, and for the first time in months he felt cautiously hopeful. Carrying a mug of black coffee, he followed the familiar path toward the apiary, expecting to hear the steady humming that had become the heartbeat of his ranch. Instead, he found silence. His steps slowed. Several wooden hives lay overturned across the grass. Broken frames were scattered through the weeds. Thousands of honeybees crawled weakly around the entrances, while countless others lay motionless beneath the boxes. Thick smoke still lingered faintly in the morning air. Daniel dropped his coffee without noticing. His knees felt weak as he lifted one damaged hive, only to find crushed combs and a frightened colony struggling to protect what remained of its queen. For several long seconds he simply stood there. He had survived drought, debt, ridicule, and loneliness, but watching living colonies destroyed by human hands hurt in a way he had never expected. Rebecca had once told him that kindness made people vulnerable. Standing among the broken hives, Daniel finally understood what she meant. Michael Brooks arrived less than 20 minutes later after receiving Daniel's call. One look at the apiary was enough. "This wasn't animals," Michael said quietly. "Somebody wanted this to happen." Laura Bennett reached the ranch shortly afterward, carefully inspecting the damaged colonies. She noticed crushed frames, broken hive lids, and heavy smoke residue far stronger than any beekeeper would normally use. Looking at Daniel, she spoke with complete certainty. This wasn't an accident. Before anyone could begin repairs, the county agricultural office called to postpone the scheduled inspection. Without healthy colonies to evaluate, officials could not approve Daniel's pollinator restoration program. Daniel thanked them politely before ending the call. He never let them hear the disappointment in his voice. Barely an hour later, a spotless black pickup rolled slowly into the ranch driveway. Victor Hayes stepped out, wearing perfectly pressed jeans, polished leather boots, and a crisp white shirt that somehow remained untouched by dust. His carefully trimmed gray beard and confident smile created the image of a successful businessman concerned for a struggling neighbor. "I heard something terrible happened," Victor said softly. Daniel looked directly into his eyes. "News travels fast." Victor glanced toward the destroyed hives before shaking his head with rehearsed sympathy. "This is exactly what I was afraid of. Bees are unpredictable. Sometimes they collapse. Sometimes they leave. Sometimes they're simply more trouble than they're worth." He paused before lowering his voice. "It isn't too late to save the harvest. My company can install a complete crop recovery system next week." Daniel said nothing. For the first time since they had met, Victor's offer sounded less like business and more like opportunity waiting beside disaster. After Victor finally drove away, Michael remained standing beside the driveway, watching the truck disappear over the hill. "He came too quickly," Michael murmured. Daniel turned toward him. "What do you mean?" Michael folded his arms. "Nobody outside this ranch knew about the damage until you called me and Laura. Yet somehow Victor arrived before noon with a sales proposal already prepared." The thought settled heavily between them. Then Michael suddenly snapped his fingers. The cameras. Several weeks earlier, after coyotes had wandered near Daniel's remaining cattle, Michael had quietly installed motion-activated security cameras overlooking both the pasture gate and the apiary. In the confusion of the morning, everyone had forgotten they were there. The three hurried into the farmhouse. For several minutes the recordings showed nothing except darkness, wind, and distant crickets. Then, at 2:14 a.m., bright headlights appeared beyond the service road. A pickup truck slowly entered the frame. A man wearing dark clothing stepped out carrying a commercial bee smoker far larger than ordinary beekeepers used. He flooded several hives with thick smoke until thousands of confused bees poured into the night air. After that, he kicked over hive boxes one by one, smashed wooden frames with a metal bar, and scattered equipment across the grass to resemble a natural colony collapse. Finally, he removed his cap. Nobody spoke. The security camera captured Victor Hayes's face with perfect clarity. Daniel leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. He did not feel anger. He felt relief. For days he had questioned himself, wondering whether he had somehow failed the bees he had promised to protect. Now he knew the truth. Within an hour, Sheriff Owen Mitchell arrived at the ranch. At 56, Owen was a broad-shouldered lawman with silver hair cropped short, thoughtful brown eyes, and a reputation for speaking little while noticing everything. Years investigating rural crimes had taught him that small communities survived only when honesty outweighed influence. After quietly reviewing every second of the footage, Owen removed his hat. "I've seen enough." Before sunset, the video had been delivered to county investigators, and Grace Sullivan had verified its authenticity before publishing a factual report instead of speculation. The reaction spread across Harper County faster than any rumor ever had. Farmers who had mocked Daniel arrived carrying lumber, replacement hive boxes, and protective equipment. Some apologized with words. Others simply picked up hammers and went to work. As the last rays of sunlight crossed the recovering apiary, Daniel realized something remarkable. Victor Hayes had tried to destroy his bees. Instead, he had united an entire community behind them. Early October painted the Walker Ranch with colors Daniel Walker had almost forgotten were possible. The orchards glowed beneath crisp blue skies, wildflowers still lined the fence rows, and the steady hum of honeybees blended with birdsong that had been absent for years. Standing near the apiary at sunrise, Daniel watched workers leave their hives in golden waves, each tiny flight reminding him how close he had come to losing everything only a few months earlier. The damage caused by Victor Hayes had healed faster than anyone expected. Volunteers had spent several weekends rebuilding broken hive boxes, replacing frames, and planting additional flowering strips where damaged ground had been disturbed. Laura Bennett continued monitoring every colony, pleased to see healthy brood patterns returning throughout the apiary. She often reminded visitors that recovery was never created by one miracle, but by hundreds of small, consistent decisions made over time. Harvest proved her right. Daniel's apple orchard produced its largest crop in nearly a decade. Pumpkins covered the fields in bright orange rows that stretched toward the horizon, while the alfalfa yielded a second cutting many neighboring farms believed impossible after such difficult seasons. More surprising than the harvest itself was everything growing around it. Monarch butterflies floated above blooming asters. Native bumblebees shared flowers with managed honeybees. Swallows circled overhead hunting insects, while quail returned to nest beneath restored hedgerows. The ranch no longer looked like land struggling to survive. It looked like land that had remembered how to live. When county inspectors returned for their postponed evaluation, they spent nearly an entire day walking the property instead of only inspecting the hives. They examined flowering corridors, reviewed Daniel's management records, measured pollinator activity, and compared current production with previous seasons. By late afternoon, the lead inspector smiled, signed the final approval documents, and officially recognized Walker Ranch as one of the county's leading examples of pollinator-based ecological restoration. Daniel accepted the certificate quietly, understanding that the paper mattered far less than the life surrounding it. News spread well beyond Harper County. Agricultural organizations requested presentations. Beekeeping associations invited Daniel to speak. Schools asked whether students could visit during spring bloom to learn how pollinators supported food production. Rather than charging expensive admission, Daniel organized simple educational tours, believing that knowledge became more valuable when shared freely. One Saturday morning, 3 buses carrying students rolled through the front gate. Among the visitors was Emma Foster, a 16-year-old high school student with long blonde hair tied into a practical ponytail, bright blue eyes, and endless curiosity about wildlife. Growing up on her family's grain farm had taught Emma that modern agriculture often focused only on machines and yields. Watching thousands of bees moving peacefully through flowering plants changed the way she viewed farming forever. Before leaving, she quietly told Daniel she wanted to study environmental science in college so she could help farmers rebuild healthy ecosystems instead of simply treating problems after they appeared. Her words touched Daniel more deeply than any newspaper headline ever could. Perhaps the greatest surprise arrived one cool afternoon when Roy Carter pulled his pickup beside the apiary. He climbed out carrying a notebook instead of another joke. "I've got something to admit," Roy said with an embarrassed smile. "I spent half the summer laughing at you." Daniel chuckled. "I noticed." Roy looked toward the flowering fields where bees drifted calmly between blossoms. I was wrong. A few days later, Laura visited Roy's ranch, helping him choose locations for his first 10 beehives and native flower strips. Watching his old neighbor begin the same journey felt strangely satisfying. Daniel never mentioned the months of ridicule. Some victories were too meaningful to waste on revenge. Late one autumn evening, after the last visitors had gone home, Daniel walked alone through the orchard, carrying only his father's weathered pocket knife, a keepsake he had carried for nearly 30 years. He stopped beneath the oldest apple tree on the property, planted by his grandfather shortly after returning from military service. The branches bent heavily beneath fruit, while bees completed their final flights before winter. He closed his eyes and remembered something his father had repeated throughout every harvest of his childhood. If you want abundant crops, first protect the smallest lives that help them grow. As a boy, Daniel had thought his father was talking only about bees. Now he understood he had also been talking about patience, humility, and respect for the quiet work that rarely received applause. The ranch had not been saved by insects alone. It had been saved by the courage to trust evidence instead of pride, by neighbors willing to admit they were wrong, and by one man who refused to abandon the land that had shaped his family for 3 generations. The gentle humming rising from the hives carried across the cool autumn air like a promise. As long as those wings kept flying, hope would always have a home at Walker Ranch. Perhaps the greatest harvest was never the apples, the pumpkins, or the honey. Perhaps it was the reminder that hope sometimes arrives in quiet ways, carried on tiny wings that most people never stop to notice. In our own lives, we may not always see the results of every kind choice, every patient effort, or every act of faith right away. But that doesn't mean those small things aren't changing something beneath the surface. If Daniel's story touched your heart, please share it with someone who could use a little hope today. We'd also love to hear from you in the comments. What small act has made a big difference in your own life? And if you enjoy inspiring stories about kindness, courage, and second chances, don't forget to subscribe and join our growing family. May God bless you, your family, and your home with peace, good health, and hope. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.